But let's move on now to our clinical lecture. And our speaker today is a good friend of mine, Len Connor. Len started his career as a dental technician. He earned his CDT. But, for the last 30 plus years, he's been a leader in the dental implant field in education. He's been a technical expert. He spent over 20 years as the director of technical specialties group at Zimmer Biomet. And then he was the director of education, technical support, and clinical affairs for Zest Dental. He is a fountain of information of the extremely practical kind. And his topic today is overdentures and how to avoid common complications and how to deal with them when they do occur. It's a great topic. I'm looking forward to hearing Len Connor talk about this topic with you. Len, it's all yours.
So I want to thank Nicole and Dr. Park, and of course the Glidewell Laboratories for giving me this opportunity to talk on some things that I've had a lot of experience with over the years. Like Dr. Park had mentioned, I've been in implant dentistry a long time. I've been in the laboratory business a long time. I've done a lot of chairside work, got to work with a lot of great clinicians. And one of the things that I found, especially I would say over the last 10 years, is overdentures can be the easiest thing you can do, but they have the most difficult problems to diagnose once something happens. And I think that's what I like to talk about, because there's only a handful of things that are really common. And once you kind of know what they are, it's pretty easy to take care of. So that's kind of how I addressed it today. We're going to talk about a lot about locators, of course, because it is the #1 selling abutment in implant dentistry today, globally, because Zest makes locator abutments for virtually every system on the market. So we'll talk about that. I also want to talk a little bit about bar restorations, because bars are something that we don't see quite as much anymore. But there's a couple of things to be aware of with bars, especially as you guys are going to see patients coming in that have had bars in there for a long time, because now's about the time that a lot of things start happening. So we'll look at some options with that as well. All right. This is a great slide to get started with, because one of the biggest considerations that clinicians tend to forget to check out up front is how much space do we need for the type of restoration that we're going to do. And that's really important, because I've seen a ton of cases, starting from when I was way back in the lab making removable partial frameworks, and we would get a case that hadn't been articulated. We'd articulate it up, see the type of framework they'd want to make, and the opposing teeth were biting right into the frame or right into the rest seat or the clasp, something like that. It's even worse with overdenture applications, because everyone thinks, oh, the patient's lost so much bone, they're going to have so much interoral space available, but they don't, because the denture, as they lose their teeth, they lose the bone, the jaw also collapses. So you end up with very limited interocclusal space. This is a great slide to illustrate the minimum amount of spaces you need for the types of restorations in overdentures that you're looking to do. Whether it's going to be, in this case, we're not really talking about fixed overdentures today. We're just going to be talking about removables, but you can see those types of numbers that you have in there. All right. The #1 thing, especially for patients who already have different restorations, is what the heck am I looking at when the patient comes in? Because when you look at this slide right here, this is probably a good illustration of the majority of the different overdenture attachments that are on the market. The one thing that's actually missing here is the Sterngold ERA attachment, which is somewhere between the cross between like a locator, a Novalock, and kind of the early version of locators as well, So it looks similar. The biggest difference between locators, Novalock, and an ERA attachment is that the ERA attachment is a cone shape as opposed to a parallel walled with an outside type of retention, The ERA has an internal retention mechanism. So that's about the biggest difference there. But all of these appliances here, essentially from your perspective, once you are able to identify what it is that you've got, right, the process to refresh them, so to speak, meaning put in new retentive components, change out the housings, put in new O-rings or whatever, are essentially the same. So as we walk through it, a couple illustrations with some locator cases, right? Just keep in mind that you're going to want to do those exact same steps with a Dalbo, with a Pressy Clicks, with an O-ring, with a Novalock, etc. Right? I like overdenture attachments, especially locators, right? I've been even when I was with Zimmer, for the 20 plus years, my most recent incarnation was with them, right? I did a lot of lectures on overdentures, and the number one component that we would talk about, myself and my tech education team, when it came to removable overdentures, was locator abutments. And the reason for that is there are a number of different things about locators that people don't know. First, right, when a locator housing is seated down on top of the abutment in the patient's mouth, right, it's in function. However, the housing itself is mobile, right? So that there's space between the top of the insert and the bottom of the housing that allows that to go up and down. So as the patient compresses the denture in the soft tissue, right, you're not immediately loading the appliance. Additionally, the self-aligning portion, this is where it really became a big advantage for us in the overdenture world, is the self-aligning. The patient can get the denture pretty close and then snap it into place. Whereas some of those other components, like the Dalbos or the balls, you have to get those pretty much lined up all the way and then push them down straight, right? They're not going to self-align. So a great opportunity for that. It's also really important that you use, right, the processing components for any of these appliances that you're using. For example, with locators, you have the black processing housing and cap that comes into the metal housing, right? That black processing housing is actually oversized, right? So it makes up the space when you put in your final cap. It allows that to move a little bit more. So you don't want to use that black processing housing as a no retentive insert, right? You'd want to use the non-retentive inserts, like the clear ones instead of, or the gray ones instead of going and using the black housings. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And we'll also talk about that with bars too, because it's the same way, processing bar attachments. One of the other things that's really great about locators is when you look at this little chart right here, it's got the lowest occlusal stack up height of any of those overdenture abutments that are on the market. So where that's really helpful is, again, when you get to that situation where you're really limited on interocclusal height and you can't open the patient's bite any further, right? It's really nice to know that that's the shortest abutment you're going to be able to get in there and the lowest stack up height necessary for your component. So when we actually looked at that chart right up front, and it said you needed a minimum of 10 millimeters for a removable overdenture type of appliance, with locator attachments, you can actually get down to 8 because of the stack up, excuse me, and functional height of the component itself. Critical factor right here. Now we're starting to talk about some of the issues that you can get into, right? It's very important with any of these abutments that you measure the tissue height and get the correct abutment height. So for example, with locator attachments, you measure the soft tissue, whatever the highest tissue level is, right, around that implant, that's the abutment size that you order. For example, with locators, you got 2 millimeters of tissue, you get the 2 millimeter abutment height, because locators have the functional portion of the abutment built in. So when you get a 2 millimeter abutment, it's really 3.5 millimeters, right? Because that 1.5 millimeters that sticks up is where the cap's going to snap down over the top of it to hold your denture in place. That's the functional portion. With other overdenture attachments, especially with balls, Dalbos, etc., where you have that external component as well, you need to add a millimeter to your collar height. So for example, say we have 2 millimeters of soft tissue around here. You want to get a ball attachment or an O-ring abutment. You need to add a millimeter to that height. So you need to get a 3 millimeter attachment. And the reason for that is those are specifically measured on the collar itself, right? And so you need to add that extra so that the soft tissue is not going to grow over the functional aspect of those abutments, because they have that undercut underneath the housing that allows those things to function, right? So with locators, right, order the abutment height with the highest point of soft tissue. With other overdenture abutments, right, and actually you can do the same with ERA, right? Order the height of abutment based on the soft tissue. With O-rings, stalbos, anything that's going to be snapping down on top with some kind of a platform, right? You want to add in 1 millimeter to your collar height so that it's going to be above the tissue enough so the soft tissue won't eventually grow over that and start to interfere with the seat of your denture. Angulation is also a concern with all of these different abutments, right? Actually, the ball attachments and O-rings are much more susceptible to wear over time than locators or ERAs or the Novalock abutment as well. Because the more off axis you are, the more wear on a parallel functional aspect of it you're going to get on that off axis side. So it's really important that you understand what that angulation is, because a lot of these systems will have components that are built specifically for off-axis components, off-axis implant placement. So it's important to know what that is, because a laboratory can really help you with different parts that can make that not as much of an issue going down the line, right? This is a great slide, not just because it's for locators, but honestly, I pretty much put this in every slide presentation that I did, because I always forgot what the poundage is, right, to retain the denture in the overdentures on top of locator attachments. Right? I can tell you the majority of cases that I've seen over the years, if the implants are fairly parallel, that you're going to see on the standard range, you're going to see the blue and pink. If you're starting to use the clear ones on a regular basis, you're going to have some problems pretty quick after that. And we'll talk about that here in a second. On the extended range, right, any implants that are off axis more than 20 degrees, right, you're going to use those extended range. And the difference is standard range has that little button in the middle. So you have retention on the inside and the outside. With the extended range, you're going to get your retention on the outside. There's no little button in the middle, which allows for an easier off-axis path of insertion, right? And you'll notice that they bumped up the poundage on those a little bit more to make up for missing that little button in the middle. The majority of cases that I've seen with extended range are generally, as you can imagine, are going to be red or they're going to be orange. This is also a good slide if for some reason you've got a patient that you don't want to have any retention, right? They're palsied or have a very difficult time getting their denture out, right? Use those gray inserts. Don't leave in the black processing housings, because then your abutments and restorative component in the denture aren't going to work correctly, right? Locators are supposed to be able to move with the denture on top of the abutments, right? And the caps stay in place. But since the black processing housing is oversized to make room for that space, if you leave the black processing housings in there, you've got a static appliance, right? When the patient bites down, right, you're immediately loading those implants. When the patient goes into function, you're immediately putting lateral force on there, right? And they're going to be a lot less likely to be able to self-angulate to seat, because there's no functionality in the black processing housings. They're there to make up that extra space for your final. So if you've got patients where you need, for some reason, you want no retention on that particular abutment, use your gray inserts. Don't use the black inserts that come with the housing, right? We talked about placing abutments, and this is the same with any of these abutments, right? It's not just putting them in and tightening down to finger pressure, right? You need to make sure that you torque them. The minimal torque for any overdenture abutment is going to be 20 Newton centimeters of torque, right? Locators recommend 30. And honestly, there isn't one abutment on the market that you shouldn't torque down to 30, right? Those are all rated for that. A lot of them still will say 20, and that's because they've just never updated their specs. But 30 Newton centimeters of torque is the accepted amount of torque needed for overdenture attachments on the market today. All right. Critical factor here too, right? See this little silicone O-ring sitting around the outside of this abutment. Whether you're using O-rings, Dalbos, ball attachments, ERAs, Novalock, locators, whatever, always use the block-out components they provide, or if they don't, use block-out wax, Periopack, something like that, to block out around the underside of the abutments. Anything that's going to fit under that retentive component, you want blocked out so that when you pick it up chairside, right, you're not going to get acrylic or your pickup material underneath into the undercuts between the 2 implants or 3 implants or 4 implants that are going to lock that into place, right? You need to be able to get that out. So you want to block out all those undercuts, because believe me, I've been chairside 3 times when it's happened. You don't want to be trying to get that denture out and it doesn't come out, because your only option at that point is, right, you're cutting it out. Patients aren't really very accepting as to why you're cutting their new denture out of their mouth the first time that you seated it in place. So make sure any undercuts you block out using these rings. And actually, these will work on most of those overdenture abutments on the market too, right? And don't think you just have to use one. If you've got this abutment sticking up a couple of millimeters above the tissue for whatever reason, maybe the patient had them in there already and they've lost a little soft tissue, put 2 or 3 of them on, right? The key is, as long as you can snap that housing on, if you see space underneath there, slap on another silicone ring. All right. So this is what it should look like, right? No space underneath there. The same thing with those other overdenture appliances either, right? No space between the functional aspect that goes into the denture and the abutment itself, right? With the denture, right? One of the things that we always recommend as well, technicians and education people from implant companies as well, is that you pick the components up chair size. That's going to be the most reliable aspect. A lot of laboratories, though, can process them, the housings into the dentures, but you want to make sure that you talk to the technician first and that you're comfortable with their ability to do that. Because there are a couple things they have to do a little bit different, right? So if they just go ahead, right, use the analogs, put the housings on or whatever it may be, and then process the denture to it, you're probably going to have to do some adjusting to the underside of that restoration, the denture, when you seat it in the patient's mouth, because stone is not going to duplicate the movement of soft tissue. So you need to be able to have that so that the components function. And all of these abutments on the market are supposed to allow for a little bit of independent movement from the denture itself when it's in function. So you want to make sure you remove any areas that may interfere or impinge with the housings, right? And usually that means you're probably going to be about 1.5 millimeters, maybe even 2 millimeters bigger around your housing than the actual housing itself. And the reason for that is, again, you want to make sure you've got enough space around there so there's no impingement, so the denture seats fine on its own, right? And you have enough space for the pickup material that you're going to use to hold the housing in. Another thing you want to make sure of, right? A lot of laboratories will take the denture, they'll matte fabricate it, they'll leave you space in the denture to go ahead and pick up those housings. You'll see, oh, I got plenty of space here. Make sure you've got undercuts or diatorics cut into those little sleeves in the denture material itself, because there isn't really anything on the market that you're going to use that is going to bond specifically on a molecular level to pre-processed acrylics or vinyls or whatever you may be using for your denture material. So you want to depend on those undercuts to hold those appliances in place. So go ahead, put some undercuts in there. I know Zest has a good little kit for putting undercuts in. Sterngold does, Preet does as well. I actually have a list at the end of the presentation of support that you can go for these different appliances. And any of those guys that are on there can really help you as far as making sure you've got the right things to, the right equipment, etc. All right. So we've got it blocked out. Now we'll go ahead. This is an old slide. Actually, we're using the early light setup, Triad gel on this particular case, but there are a lot of great materials on the market now. Sterngold has a great pickup material that's light cured. Zest has a great material that's dual cured, so it can be light cured or it'll set up on its own. I know Preet carries a lot of good materials as well. I'm sure that your techs at at Glidewell have some materials that they recommend as well, especially for picking stuff up chairside, right? It's also really important because this is another factor when clinicians do their first cases, right? This can be an issue. They don't put enough material into the undercut housing or in the undercut sleeve in the denture, and they don't put enough material on the housing. So what happens is they'll seat the denture, right? Everybody does ring around the rosy around the patient while we're waiting for everything to set, right? You go and you take the denture off. One cap comes off, the other one stays in the mouth, right? So you need to make sure in order to do that, you need to put enough material in. On average, you should probably fill up the channel in the denture about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way. Don't fill it all the way up because then you're going to have too much material to clean off. But if you fill it up 2/3 to 3/4 of the way in that little sleeve that's in your denture, and then you add some material on the top and around the outside of the housings, you're going to have enough material in there to make sure you can pick it up, right? That way, and it won't be too much that you have to clean up so much off the intaglio side of the denture. It's also important, whenever possible, you use vent holes, right? Vent holes are important for a couple of reasons. One, it allows any material to be extruded out as you seat the denture, right? So that hydrostatic pressure is not going to keep the denture from seating all the way. And two, right, if you seat your denture and no material comes out of the vent holes, you're going to know you didn't put enough material in. My recommendation as far as where you want to put your vent holes, right, is right in this area right here, right? Either on the lingual side or on the buccal, but you want to put it right at the base of where that housing seats around your blockout gasket, because that way, if you seat it down and you extrude material up there, you know it's going all the way around the housing, and you've got enough material around there to pick up the housing, right? If you don't see anything extrude from there with it in that position, then you know you don't have enough material, right? So that's the best place to put it. Ideally on the lingual or the palatal, but like right around the base where that housing ends up, because that way you know where it's going to go, right? Then, of course, once you pick it up, right, bite's going to be a key issue. Usually the recommendation is have the patient, right, clear the bite, make sure the patient can get it on and off, and then have them come back in a week to 10 days, right, to make any adjustments that you may need to, either on the underside of the framework or adjusting the bite again. Now that the patient's gotten used to it, right, they're going to establish a new bite pattern with their new denture. So you want to make sure that they come back in so you can make sure that they're good to go for a much longer period of time. All right. This is just an example, right, showing the light cure. It's very important as well. When you use these black processing housings, don't take the black processing housing out until you're all done with the case and ready to snap in those final components. Don't take that black processing housing out and then try and finish the underside of that denture, because it's the very lip at the bottom of that housing that holds those inserts in place. So if you smooth off or reduce material on the underside of that housing, right, your retentive inserts aren't going to stay in place. So you're going to have to end up picking it all over again, and you're going to have to use new components to pick it up with, right? So always leave that in until you're completely done. What's nice about that is the black processing housings actually have a little lip that stick out over, right, the top of that metal housing, right? So you can actually hit the top of the plastic or the black insert, and it's not going to affect your housing at all, right? So leave those in place till you're all done finishing and polishing the underside of your denture, okay? Pop those out, insert those with the tool, and anybody who has not seen the new locator seating tool, oh my gosh, it is amazing, right? So call whoever you use to get your materials from, whether it's Glidewell, whether it's Preet, whether it's Zest, Sterngold, right? And get the new seating tool for your locator inserts. You know how we always used to have to, like, right, you'd stick your insert in there and you try and pry it out, right? And after about a few times, if you couldn't get it out, it's all mashed up. And then you have to take like a Lacron or even a some type of a pointy instrument to try and pry it out. The new ones work great, so you don't have to worry with that anymore. Right? So here's what the final case looks like after the patient's had some adjustments done. This is after 2 weeks. You can see, looks to me like this bite might still be open a little bit here. So definitely something you want to look at over on this side over here as before the patient goes out the door. Check it with paper, bite indicating paste, whatever you're going to use. Just a second or two to talk about the Locator RTX, which is the new version. Huge advantage for implants that are placed off axis, right? And the advantage is they actually give you about 50% more off-axis functioning technology, right? The advantage of locators is that the inserts and the housings move with the denture, the inserts stay attached to the abutment itself, right? This allows you to get a path of insertion and an insert that's going to angulate to seat on your off-axis implants. It's a great abutment, right? It lasts a lot longer than the traditional locators because of the new surface that they developed. The housing's a little bit better. As a technician, I like it because it's easier to pick up than locator housings, right? But unless you're actually doing off-axis cases, you're fine using your traditional locator abutment. It's not like they're going to be going anywhere anytime soon, all right? So big advantage for super offset implants. However, right, you can use these abutments for cases like this where you would use traditional locators as well, right? So 10 degrees off, right? This is where you would use your standard locator housing, right? 20 degrees off, this is where you use your extended range, right? 60 degrees off, that's where you're going to use, right, your new locator RTX. However, if you find yourself in a situation like this and you put RTX in abutments in there, just use the limited range RTX insert, right? It takes up more space in the housing than the traditional one, so it doesn't move as much. The biggest advantage of the RTX is that the insert moves in the housing a lot more. So if you got two implants that are fairly straight and you put this traditional RTX abutments inserts on there, they're going to go like this, right? You can actually pick up and move the denture around. It's not going to displace, but the patient's going to say, hey, my denture is kind of moving around. Just go and use the limited range retention inserts and you'll be good to go. All right. This is a great slide because it kind of shows you, this is the most divergent you can get with any overdenture abutment on the market, which is one of the reasons I talk about it. All right. RTX locator, you can see from this that the housings are pretty much the same. The only difference between locators and RTX, as far as any measurements that you would need to know, is the ideal locator abutment seats somewhere between 1.5 to 2 millimeters above the soft tissue, right? Whereas the locator RTX somewhere between 2 and 2.5 millimeters, because we've got a little bit more functional space here so that we can get good retention, because we don't have the little button like we had on the inside of traditional locators, right? One of my favorite slides of all time, for a couple of different reasons. Anytime, and you can actually apply this to a couple of your other abutments as well. Sterngold, Novalock, obviously locators, any of those locator takeoff abutments on the market. Anytime you see silver around the functional aspect of one of those abutments, right, it's time to change those out, because that means the patient has already worn through the titanium nitride coating of the abutment and is actually now scoring the titanium alloy of the abutment itself. And that's reducing the retention that the patient's going to have with those. So you can be going with higher retention inserts, but eventually you're going to run out and you're going to have loose componentry. So whenever you see silver around these abutments, right, you got to change them out. On average, with locator attachments, that's, if they're fairly parallel, it could be 10, 15 years. But if they're, off axis, or the patient has some other kind of functional issue going on, right, it could be 5 to 7 years before you have to change these out. So I like this one because it shows that changing out locator attachments, here we're going to decide to use the RTX, right? Essentially, the process is going to be exactly the same as what you did before. This is also a great tool that you see down here on the bottom left-hand side. It's a trephine burr for removing housings. It works great when you're changing out housings. A lot of doctors say they like to change out, even if they don't have to change the abutments, and you change the inserts generally somewhere between 9 months to a year and a half on most locator cases, right? And it's more frequent on some of the other ones. And then on O-rings is a lot more frequent because they wear out really fast. But you're always going to get some amount of leakage, right? No matter what material you use to pick up or process your housings in. So some guys like to go ahead and every 5 to 7 years, take out their housings anyway, do a reline of the denture, which you should probably be doing, every 2 years at least anyway. So clean this out, right? Processing RTX abutments the same as locators. Here you can see we've got the vents down here. The reason you don't see them on the lingual is the lingual is too short, right? There's not really enough room on there. So we put them, so they're going to be right about in this position right here, so that when we seek that denture, it extrudes that material out and we know we've got enough around the housing, right? Perfect example. See how this is all chewed up right here, right? It's the same locator black insert that sticks over the outside lip of the cap that allows you to finish and polish this down, right, without chewing up your housings, right? So then after that, we put the pink inserts in here. Go ahead, finish polishing up the denture, seat it, check the bite, and we're good to go. All right. So this doesn't have anything to do with Nicole's test at the end. This is my test, right? What animal and I know I can't hear you guys, so you'll just have to Scout's honor as to answer it.
You can put the answer in the chat.
All right. What animal in the United States gets the most dental implants? Okay. Big cats in the zoo. All right. Lions, tigers, cheetahs, etc., because so much of their health is based on their ability, right, to eat, to stay healthy, right? Who wants to guess number 2? All right. Number 2 is gorillas, again in the zoo. And this is where actually some people catch number 3. Number 3 is thoroughbred racehorses, right? And for the same thing as the big cats, as athletes, it's so important for racehorses to be healthy, and so much of their health is based on their ability to eat, right, digest, to stay healthy, etc. They spend a lot of money on thoroughbred racehorses to keep them healthy. All right. All right, let's get some more common complications here so we can wrap up for this morning. Get the right abutment for the implant you've got. This actually, and these are, as you can imagine, these are all wrong. So the problem here is that the majority of dental implants on the market only use 2 different thread patterns. The majority of implants manufactured in the United States or that are copies of implants that were manufactured in the US have a 172 thread pattern. The majority of implants that came over from Europe or are copies of implants from Europe have a 2 millimeter thread pattern. So that means if you've got an old locator in the drawer that you got for a case 5 years ago, and you try it in, it's a 50-50 chance at best. Actually, in the US, it's more likely it's going to be 172, but the abutment's going to thread into the implant body, right? Just because it threads in doesn't mean it works, right? Because you can look at all of these abutments all threaded in, but none of them are seated into the implant body because they're not the right one. So when you're picking out any of your attachments, you've got to know not just the company name. For example, I have a Corvette implant, right? Well, that's a real fun one because there was 10 different Corvette implants. Or I have a Zimmer, or Straumann or Nobel or whoever, right? There's so many different implant systems on the market, you have to bring it down closer. I have a Nobel Active implant, okay? And then if you've got one of the different ones, or Nobel Replace, or is it Nobel Replace, Nobel Replace Select, right? So you've got to know what the implant is so you can get the right abutment. There are a number of different companies out there that will help you with that, identifying what those implants are. Most implant companies, I would say myself, I probably currently, I still probably look at 10 x-rays a day that I get from different reps that I, have known over my time in implant dentistry, asking me if I can tell them what the implant is so they can get the right parts. But it's very important to understand which implant you've got so you can get the right stuff to start with. All right. Getting enough pickup material. We talked about this already. You've got to make sure you get enough pickup material around that housing. Otherwise, right, no matter what it is, O-ring, locator, ERA, Novalock, the housing's not going to come off in the denture, and you're going to have to do it again, right? It's generally not recommended that you pick up one attachment at a time, right? You should probably, unless you have them way back in the posterior and you've got like 6, you should ideally pick them all up at the same time because your passive seat of your denture is going to be the easiest then. All right. Critical factor as well. A lot of clinicians like to use the housings, right, of all their different attachments to pick up when they want to do a reline of the denture, right? You don't want to use the housings. The reason for that is they don't have enough outside retention for impression material, right, to be able to hold them in place. So what you need to use is if the system that you're using has a reline pickup or insert or impression coping, you want to use those. A lot of guys complain, though, that those are too tall and you can't fit them in the denture, right, that you want to do the reline on because it's too thin. You can actually modify almost all of those, right? Take a burr, take a disc, right? Cut that little circle in half, that little wine glass thing, just leave one little piece up, right? Put external grooves, etc., on the outside of the housing so you've got more retention, right? But don't use the housings themselves to transfer that impression because any lab technician will tell you when they go to pour it up, so often those things will fall out or come out of the impression. And they have to put them back in, and they may or may not be in exactly the right place, right? And you can't tell. So make sure you've got a good solid component into your impression, especially when you're doing relines. All right. Space between implants, right? Everyone knows that's a big deal, right? Obviously, this case does not have enough space between the implants for what we know for biologic width, etc. The ideal space between two dental implants, right, is 3 millimeters, right? 1.5 millimeters all the way around. That's for the health of the implant, but that doesn't take into consideration the functionality of your restoration, right? I mean, look at this. This case doesn't have enough space there either, to the point that you can see we couldn't even get the surgical cover screw all the way down on this, and we ended up using one big monster restoration with a huge undercut here, right? Talk about a food trap, right? To make this case work. Spacing is critical, right? You look at this case, you're maybe, no, we probably have 3 millimeters of space here between these, right? But you have to take into consideration not just the space that you need for the implants, for the health and the soft tissue and the bone around the implants, but for the appliance that you're fabricating for the patient. For example, this case looks great from an implant perspective. However, from a functional perspective for an overdenture, it's a failure. Ideally, you need 4 to 6 millimeters between your implants to use locators or any functional overdenture abutment. 4 millimeters is the minimum just to get the two housings seated, right? Same thing with O-rings. Sometimes O-rings are even a little bit wider. So you need 4 millimeters just to get the housings to seat. If you want functionality, like the abutments are supposed to function on their own, right? Then you actually need to be out here 6 millimeters, right? To get enough space. That way the inserts are going to function individually, and you're going to get function on the denture as the patient functions, and not group function where they can only move in one position based on what the other ones do. So for example, here you've got a patient that had 4 implants placed. As you can see on here, we don't even have enough space to put another housing in here. And on this one, they're so close together, we actually just use this as an anterior stop. The retentive factor is coming in from this and this. So the patient had 4 implants placed. Essentially, they're only able to take advantage of the retention factor and stability of 2 locator attachments. All right. So you need to have that extra space. One of the things I love to talk about, too many people don't think of this. Using locator attachments or ball attachments, this is the best time to get a patient into any type of a removable prosthesis, right? Using an overdenture attachment, right? While they still have something to compare it to, right? Patients who are wearing removable partial frameworks are the ideal patients for overdenture abutments of whatever kind you're using, because they're going to get the idea and they're going to be able to see the support that they have from those different abutments, right? Before, for example, they lose those anterior teeth and now have to go to a full denture. So this is a great place to start talking to patients about using overdenture attachments. Whether you're going to use patient's existing root and doing a custom cast attachment over that, or you're going to place mini diameter or small diameter, narrow diameter implants, right? And use them as temporaries until the patient needs to go to a larger treatment plan or whatever the case may be. It's a great opportunity to get them thinking about what they can have further down the line, right? While they still have something to compare it to. It's going to be a lot easier when this patient loses all the rest of their teeth to say, so do you want us to put in a couple of more retentive components like you have so that your denture stays in place like your removable partial did, right? And they're going to absolutely be a lot more interested in hearing it then than when you remove all their teeth and they go to a full denture and they don't know the difference, right? So I really like that case. Multi-unit abutments, right? Zest has a version of an abutment that seats down over a good chunk of the multi-unit abutments on the market. So if you've got implants off at various access or off angles, you can go ahead and straighten those back up with your locator attachment. Stern Gold actually has different abutment angulations that you can place or adjust your abutment the same way to get the angulation that you need. So 2 different ways of getting the same thing. Everybody has scan bodies now, which is great that you can use those to establish the need and be able to scan in your appliances and have the laboratory do their custom materials or custom frameworks. Last couple words, I want to talk about bar retained overdentures, because bar retained overdentures were the best thing we had going early on in implant dentistry. Today, they can be your worst nightmare, especially patients who've been wearing them for any length of time, because what happens is your denture, as you can imagine right here, rotates around these appliances, right? So you're always subjected to potential of anterior posterior lift when the patient goes into function. A little bit different here. Here's the spaces that you're looking at, right? So like we said with locators, with ERAs, here we're looking at, 10.5, right? Normal height for these types of appliances, though, you're going to be in that 14 to 20 Newton centimeter range based on the stack up of the components that go on top of the bar as well, right? So space is going to be a factor, right? Oops, sorry. As well as. So this appliance right here can potentially, when a patient comes in like this, if they're happy with what they have in their mouth as far as the denture goes, good, don't touch it, right? Because that can be the biggest problem that they can have going down the line is they get additional movement on top of these bars. Additionally, over time, right, this bar is going to wear. And you're going to have to replace this whole custom appliance. The good thing is most laboratories are milling these now. So it's not quite the same. I would much rather see something like this, where you've got a milled bar. And the reason we would do that is because we want to splint the implants together, get a little more stability, right? But then using some type of an overdenture abutment on top of that, that still allows the denture to function freely like it's supposed to, okay? All of these different components go into the factor of bars. Just like with overdenture components, right? With bars, make sure you use the processing components, because these attachments are supposed to be able to move a little bit in these housings as well, right? To give a little bit of functionality so you're not immediately loading, right? Always use the processing components. Never pick up the final attachments in the patient's mouth, because then they don't work. They're just going to sit there static, right? Anterior, posterior rock, the biggest problem that we had with implants when we would do 2 and connect them with the bar. If you've got 4 implants, right, that you go around the corner a little bit, you eliminate that, but then the denture doesn't have as much ability to function as the patient functions than it does with the freestanding appliance. Right? Interocclusal space on these types of appliances, like I said, you need more. This is where I would see a lot of problems early on, and actually even still today, right? We had this great bar fabricated on here. The laboratory did a ton to go ahead and make that. That's probably one of the shortest bars I've ever seen, right? However, the patient is still biting into that bar. So this is what your appliance looks like when it's done, right? There's hardly enough acrylic to hold the clip in place, and the patient's biting right into that framework. However, they do have that ability, right? A little bit more space on here, but they do have that ability to fill out the patient's face because of what you can do with labial flanges, etc. All right. This is my idea of a bar, milled and with overdenture attachments on top that still allow the denture to go ahead and function. I just like to put this up here as we're at the end of our presentation. This is something I have a lot of experience on. I actually do have a couple of papers that I've written over the years when I was with Zimmer specifically, talking about the removal of broken abutments, removal of broken implants, and abutment screws. There's a number of different supports on the marketplace where you can get help with this. if anybody wants that, I think I have my email address at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to shoot me an email, and I'll be glad to send you a copy of what I put together in the past. It's really not as hard as you think to remove a broken screw. It's just very intimidating because it's so small, right? And it's all about access. So there's a number of different things you can do before you take the implant out, right? So for my last slide of the presentation, right? This is something that this the Eastern California Museum in Independence is just a couple hours north of me. So this is almost like local, but it's amazing what patients will do not to go to the dentist. This is a perfect example of that. One of the other presentations that I really like to do is what were they thinking with some of the things that patients have come up with. So maybe sometime in the future, I'll see you down the road and we'll get to talk about that. So here are the support and resources that I make the most use of myself. Of course, Glidewell Laboratories. Preet Corporation has pretty much anything you can think of when it comes to attachments as well. Of course, Zest Dental Solutions, Sterngold Inc. Both of those two abutment companies have a lot of technical information. They have a lot of good products, and I recommend them both. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Park and Nicole and Glidewell Laboratories for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Len. I have to tell you, that was one of the best overdenture lectures I have ever heard. Even after all my years, I learned a lot of great stuff. That was a really terrific job. Very, very practical. Len, we've got some questions from our audience, and it's a big group, and it looks like nobody's left yet. So we're gonna answer these questions, even though we're gonna go over a little bit.
Thank you.
The first one I believe you answered. Now, they asked about if you have angled abutments for divergent cases. You mentioned like the RTX will go up to 30 degrees each, 60 degree in combination. But then you talked about if you're beyond that, you could put a multi-unit abutment and a locator on top of that.
Correct. So the locator RTX abutments, 30 degrees. If you look at 30 degrees off axis, that's 60 on both sides. That's really off. I remember when I saw the first model that Zest put together to demonstrate what that was, it was like, well, I know I've seen implants that have been off that far, but wow, that's crazy. So that's
and they're not angled abutments per se. They will basically just work even though they're straight abutments. What do you think about this idea of doing the MUA? I mean, because when you're angled like that, you're putting a different kind of force on the implants. Implants don't do as well with torquing forces than they do with straight on forces.
That's true. One of the things that's great though about using those MUA abutments and then using for example, the locator MUA is the fact that you're not loading the implants, right? You're using it for denture retention, but not support. So it's still a tissue supported appliance, as opposed to some of the other ways to go. For example, like I said, Sterngold actually makes angled abutments that allow you to straighten, off-axis implants back up by using their 11 degree or their 15 degree abutment to straighten those back up. And again, the reason you can do that is because they're still tissue supported appliances. So you're not off-axis loading your implants.
Great point, Len. Here's a question from one of our doctors. I have a maxillary implant overdenture patient with very tall locators well above the gums, probably from some recession in the past. The denture seats well, but the patient can make the denture drop down from the roof of the mouth very easily, even when I use the green attachments. Any suggestions to keep it seated or help me understand why this is happening?
Well, the first thing I would look at with that in mind is I would look at the abutments and make sure that there's no wear on the abutments themselves. Sometimes you can look at that on the outside, everything still looks okay. But then when you look into the implant abutment itself, you'll see that it's worn in there. A lot of times it will become oblong, so you don't have as much retention as you did with the housings. Additionally, a lot of times, if your abutments are taller than they should be, you're actually still getting a lot of lateral movement. And that will also start to wear your housings out really fast. Not that it wears them out as much, but it actually stretches them because you're not getting as, the forces are being applied much higher than at the base where they're meant to be applied. So I would look at, definitely look at the abutments, right? Is there any wear on them? Look at the positioning as well. As long as a denture fits, probably doesn't need to be relined. But if she still keeps having that same problem, I would probably recommend using shorter abutments and then just go ahead and repick those up.
Got it. Got it. Good idea. Good idea. Here's a question, and you mentioned this idea of when two implants with locators on them are very close to each other. In this case, the locators are parallel, but they are quite close. Should we use a regular or the limited type of insert?
Well, it depends. If they're RTX abutments, they're the pink ones, and they're close together and fairly parallel, you should probably use the limited range inserts. Only if they're very far off axis are you going to want to use the traditional standard range for RTX.
Okay. Okay, when you're picking up a locator, do you have the patient bite down with pressure or just bite down lightly?
Most doctors who have been doing it for a while actually don't have the patient bite down. What they'll do is they'll seat the denture and they'll hold it in place. That way they're applying the amount of force that they want. You don't want to apply force because if you actually compress the tissue and once that housing now sets, right, now that soft tissue is trying to push your denture out. So you want it just to be seated passively, which is why a lot of guys don't let the patient bite down.
Just hold with your fingers.
Just hold it with your fingers.
See, that's the tip of the day right there.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is a philosophical question. Is it worse to have too much material or not enough material when you're picking up your housings?
I would say it's worse not to have enough material because you can always use, a carbide burr on the underside and clean things up. But if you have to pick up a housing 2 or 3 times because you're not putting enough material in, that takes a lot of.
Isn't there a point where you use so much
time.
material that the denture's not seating properly?
There is, as long as you've got a vent hole, you won't have that problem. However, if you don't have a vent hole, that potentially could be a problem, especially depending on the viscosity of the material that you're using.
Use a vent hole, and then if you're going to make an error, have too much. I like it.
Right.
I like it. Len, I love the way you answer these questions.
I learned them
now
from
here's
you.
one. Can you mix and match locators on the same patient? I'm not sure. Do you think they mean RTX versus the regular locator?
That's a very good question because both of them are meant to be able to function independently. However, it's just like I would never recommend using different abutments, different retention types on the same case. My recommendation has always been use the same abutments across an implant case. Not just because
use the same abutment and use the same inserts. Is that what you're saying?
Use the same inserts, use the same abutments. Don't mix and match because, well, they're kind of going to function the same, right? They're not going to really function the same. So if a patient has, for example, if they have ERA attachments in there and you're not going to change those out, don't put a couple locators in there with them, right? If you've got locators and you bought some RTX abutments, don't really mix and match because they're not going to work exactly the same.
I like it. Same abutment, same insert throughout.
Correct.
Good recommendation. Okay, here's one. Are there any situations where you would have the lab process the housings, or do you always do a chairside pickup?
Again, the recommendation has always been to pick them up chairside because that's when you have the real feel of what the denture's like. However, there are a lot of laboratories that I wouldn't have a problem saying, let so-and-so go ahead and pick up the inserts, because they know how to do it. They know those little extra steps that you need. For example, if you're going to pick them up on a model in the laboratory, you really should have a soft tissue model to duplicate that soft tissue so you can get a good passive seat of your denture when you process it. That's the real key. If you just use a traditional stone model, snap those housings on there, pack it, and ready to go, the potential is it's going to be too stiff, right? And you're going to end up with sore spots on the underside for the patient to start off with.
Got it. So it can be done in the laboratory, but you need to make sure your laboratory is using a soft tissue model.
Right. And you just basically you need to talk to the laboratory and say, hey, are you guys processing the housings in-house? And if they are, and you feel pretty confident about what they're saying, go for it.
Very good. Okay. I do not know what this topic is. It's smart denture conversions. Are you familiar with this? They're asking about your thoughts about smart denture conversions for overdentures, and I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Smart denture conversion is a specific technique that's primarily used for fixed dentures. It's a great technique. As far as removables, I don't really see that much. I don't see an application on it. As for fixed, though, yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, you got it's a pretty quick process, and the diameter of the hole that comes through your occlusal is about a third of what a traditional all-on-X case hole through your occlusal would look like.
Okay, but for overdentures, is there an application for overdentures?
Not really, no.
Okay. All right. Okay. And here's a question about, first of all, how big of a vent hole do you make? I think that's a really good question.
Generally about a number 2 round burr. So
number 2. Okay. So that's a decent,
millimeter.
Decent size. Yeah. Number 2 round
millimeter, millimeter and a half at least. You're right. You don't want to make it too big though, because remember, you got to finish and polish that, right? And you got to have enough of material to come out to fill in the hole.
Right. Very good. Very good. Okay. Last question. Can you use a light cure material during your pickup? In other words, does the light cure material reliably set up, through the denture?
I would say from my experience, the answer to that is yes. And that's usually because when you're doing overdentures, right, the housings are going to be a lot closer to the outside of the acrylic than anything else. So when you pick those up, you're going to get light penetration into the denture. My suggestion is, though, if you're going to do that once you remove the denture, right, you go ahead and put the light down onto the housing itself on the intaglio side so that you can make sure you've got a good enough light penetration all the way through.
Fantastic. Len, it was a great lecture. So much good practical advice. And you did a super job answering the questions, which is the most fun part. And we appreciate it. Thank you to the panel for their great advice today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Join us next week. We're going to have Dr. Tim Kozinski coming back, and he's going to talk about the immediate implant, extraction, grafting, and placement. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week at the same time. Thanks a lot, Len. Good to see you.
Thanks so much. Everyone take care.
Bye-bye.